Good evening. Welcome to the Dusty Feet. Tonight, we're going to, as promised, we're going to do the Q&A part of the Exodus scrolls, the end one, because it caps on to a little of what Carmen talked about. Some of the questions came up. And this is going to be multi-part because we're going to only really address one thing they're talking about. And there's multiple questions that they talk about that. But we'll get into that as we go. So we're going to have some fun, right? As we do. So don't forget, in the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents we use here on the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. So be sure to click to subscribe. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place we can safely explore the endless ways of God, the interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so let's get in, let John and Tim talk, and then we'll bring up some points that we want to challenge. It'll be fun, but I guarantee you it's going to stretch a little bit, and some will agree, and some will disagree, and I'm fine with that. Totally fine with that. Are you is the question. So let's enjoy them on. Actually, the video is the Exodus Q&R session, but they did God try to kill Moses? We won't get there on this episode, but we will get there eventually.
Hey, Tim.
Hey, John.
We get to listen to some questions
Yes.
about the Exodus scroll.
Yeah. We took nine-ish conversations, I think maybe 10, to work through the Exodus scroll. I forget.
Yes, that sounds right.
Yeah. Then we culminated then with an interview with Carmen Imes, a friend and scholar who is actively doing research in Exodus. So that was a great conversation.
Yes.
And now we're going to interact with questions that all of you listening have sent in. This is the largest batch of questions we've ever received for a Q&R episode.
Yeah.
And what was cool about that was the repeated questions, like just the percentages, we just had a bigger sample. So like there was definitely a number one most repeated question.
Oh.
We had a bigger batch. And
Is that the one we're going to do first?
No.
Oh.
No. Well, we will talk about it.
Okay.
It's the moment where God wants to kill Moses.
Oh. Sweet.
Totally. But, okay. But first, before we dive into listener questions, we wanted to follow up with one of the episodes we did was about the test that was before Israel as they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai when God showed up in fire and cloud. And the whole thing about were all the people supposed to go up to the top of the mountain? Was that God's plan or desire? And that's confusing because God says they should come up onto the mountain, depending on what translation you read.
Yeah.
It says they should come up on the mountain, but then God seems to say they can't after he says they should.
He seems to be happy that they didn't.
There you go. That's right. And so you and I took you on a journey of what I think makes sense of all of that. And what was great was Carmen had a different take.
Yeah. Well, and your take, the journey you brought me through and the whole audience is, yes, they were meant to go up onto the mountain.
The invitation to come up onto the mountain by God
was a real invitation.
It was a real invitation.
And the test was, will you come up even though it's dangerous and you're afraid?
Yeah.
And so in your presentation, Israel failed the test.
They failed the test. And the literary design of that whole section is funky to modern Western readers because it's out of narrative sequence. But the moment that God said they should and could ascend at his invitation, the narrative really draws it out, is on the third day while the trumpet is blasting. And the narrative says, and the trumpet kept going and going, and the people don't go up.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 20 of Exodus, you get a flashback that zeroes in on that moment, and it's because the people were afraid for their lives, and they say they aren't going to go up.
Okay, so that's one interpretation.
Yeah, so it's a failure of the test because the ideal is for God's covenant partners to return to Eden, to return to his Eden presence so that they can be transformed and become his priest to the nations.
Become a kingdom of priests.
A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Yep, that's right. So that was, and bummer that they didn't, but good thing that they had someone who could.
Yes.
And that's Moses.
Right.
That's right.
And so then our conversation with Carmen, Dr. Carmen Imes, she presented a different explanation, which was that it was good that Israel didn't go up the mountain, that the invitation was there, come up onto the mountain. She agreed with that. But Israel was wise to realize and fearing the Lord that they were not in a place to go up the holy mountain. And sending up a mediator instead, Moses, was actually
God's plan.
God's plan, and was a success.
Yeah.
They actually passed the test. And the test was not, should I trust God even though it doesn't make sense and I think it'll kill me? The test was, will I second guess God? Because I know his character and I know my character. And she talked about Abraham negotiating with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, and an opportunity for us to enter into this relationship with God where we actually, because we know his character, will second guess. I suppose, is that a good way to say it?
Well, so let me, there's a few steps in there.
Yeah.
So first, Carmen is going to do her own full-scale research of the question when she gets there in her research. And so at this point, she's relying on a dissertation and work done by a scholar, Michael Kibbe, who wrote a whole dissertation about this issue.
Yeah.
And so I just want to, just for accuracy, she was representing Kibbe's work, but she was compelled by it.
Yeah.
So in Michael Kibbe, so it was great because I didn't know about his work. So I went and read his book and I learned a ton.
Okay.
And it was awesome. And this is why I love biblical studies, because you just keep learning. So Kibbe's point, essentially his conclusion is that the invitation of Israel to come up the mountain was a test to show whether or not they have an accurate assessment of themselves.
Yeah.
And what Kibbe argues is that God's real desire from the moment of the burning bush was that Israel have one mediator on their behalf, Moses.
Right.
And so he sees Israel's declining the invitation to go up the mountain as passing the test because they fear God enough to have an accurate view of themselves, that they will be consumed by the fire, not transformed by it, and that right now Moses is the only one who should go up on our behalf. And he argues that that is what God wanted, but this is the trick. What it means is that God's invitation to come up the mountain was real, but not, it was
not genuine.
It was a trick question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the twist that I think in that interpretation that you got to sit with. And then this is where it leads to, Kibbe argues that this narrative in Exodus 19 is patterned after the story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah.
And you agree with that?
I agree with that. And so he sees there Abraham passing the test by doing what God said, even though what God said seemed to contradict something God said earlier. So God said, I'm going to bless all the nations through your son. And then he says, give me back the life of your son on offering on Mount Moriah. And he sees Abraham's passing the test as being willing to do what God said, even though he knew it contradicted what God had promised earlier. And God takes that willingness and trust as passing the test. And so he sees the Israel at Mount Sinai as an inversion story. Their unwillingness to do what God says is them passing the test. This is where I start to see, for me, cracks in, for me, what becomes not compelling. So what was interesting is that for Carmen, she was also integrating the work of a Hebrew Bible scholar, J. Richard Middleton, in his book, Abraham's Silence, The Binding of Isaac, The Suffering of Job, and How to Talk Back to God. And his take is essentially, it's a book essentially about the story of Abraham and Isaac. And he argues that Abraham failed the test, that what he should have done is not silently obey God's command to sacrifice his son, but he should have done what he did for Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, which is talk back to God and mediate and advocate for the innocent.
Yeah.
And so he sees Abraham's failure to do that as a failure. So I also read that book in the last few weeks because I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed it. And with fear and trepidation, I'm not persuaded by his reading of the Abraham and Isaac story. And with fear and trepidation, because I have learned more from J. Richard Middleton about the image of God than any other scholar.
Yeah.
So I've been deeply informed by his work. And it was the first time I've ever read any of his work that I'm like, yes to some of that, but I'm not persuaded on that other part. So this is tricky. It's like, because a lot of it has to do, for me, this all comes down to narrative patterning.
Yeah.
When later stories in the Hebrew Bible are patterned after an earlier story, and the author is counting on you seeing the parallels to inform how you're supposed to read the story at hand. So when we're at Mount Sinai with Israel, we're like multiple patterns deep, because that story in Exodus is patterned after Abraham and Isaac, is patterned after the decision of Adam and Eve at the tree, and the way the fear of the Lord and the fiery appearance of Yahweh fits into that story.
And when you say narrative pattern, you mean?
Yeah. So a story in the Hebrew Bible that's later in the collection will use the actual words and phrases and images of an earlier story with such a density that it's recalling that story so that you call them both up in your mind to begin to compare and contrast them. And usually it's to help the reader. This is meditation literature. So you actually need the Adam and Eve story in Eden to understand the nuances of what's going on with Abraham and Isaac. Like the author assumes that you will bring the Eden story to bear to solve some of the interpretive puzzles in that story. And then the Exodus story is designed in such a way as to recall both of them so that you use what you learned in those earlier stories to solve puzzles in this one. And this was what I raised in the conversation with Carmen, why I loved it.
Yeah.
Because it's a question of method. What did the biblical authors expect readers to do when they notice parallels? What does it mean to read a later story in light of earlier parallels? To me, that's an interesting question raised by all this. I can tell you just where I'm at now after processing, talking with Carmen, reading those two books.
Yeah.
Or
yeah, I want to hear. But to say back, you're saying that there's two works. There's Kibbe, who says he makes a case for how Israel was meant to have a good assessment of themselves, and no, they're not ready to be in God's presence.
Yeah, their fear of the Lord and not going up the mountain, according to Kibbe, is good, and it's passing the test.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. But what you're saying is the real gravity of this argument needs to be around narrative patterning, and you brought that up with Carmen, and then what she did was introduce another scholar who actually says that will allow you to say, yes, the narrative pattern is very clear with Abraham and Isaac. But Abraham was supposed to assess what God was asking and not do it like Israel at Mount Sinai to iron out that wrinkle.
Yeah.
But then you're saying that narrative is connected to Adam and Eve,
Yes.
who were supposed to listen to the word of God and trust it and fear him. And that was clearly not second guess God. That was very clearly like, do what I'm saying.
That's right.
Don't eat that tree.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. So I think how the three stories fit together is that the Eden story, God gives a command. It's counterintuitive to Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Because both trees look good.
Right.
And one of them leads to knowing good and bad, which seems like a good, why would God not want me to have that right now?
I need that.
Yeah, I'm eventually going to need that. But it's what God said. And so they make the wrong decision. They fail that test. They fail it.
Yeah.
And it results in their being exiled from the garden by passing through fiery angelic creatures that guard the Eden mountain at the door.
Yeah.
And that exile is both an act of God's justice, it's a consequence, but it's also a mercy, because were they to, God says, access eternal life in this morally compromised state, that would be really bad. So when we get to the Abraham and Isaac story, here I'll just recall the conversations about the test we had from the test podcast series. Abraham has wronged, he and his wife have wronged and sexually abused and oppressed an Egyptian immigrant and her son in the process of trying to produce a son of their own between the two of them. And so after Abraham and Sarah have these two sons now, what God does is, because they didn't trust God to provide them life and sons by his own creative Eden blessing, but they got them through their own schemes, God takes away both of the sons that he gave.
They chose to understand good and bad on their own terms.
They redefined good and bad. They tried to produce a future for themselves and future descendants for themselves by their own wisdom, and they ended up sexually abusing and oppressing and exiling an Egyptian immigrant and her son. So what God does is he allows their sin to separate the Egyptian immigrant and her son. So he takes away Abraham's actual firstborn son. He never sees him again. And then he asks for the life of Isaac back. And so in dialogue with Carmen and J. Richard Middleton, Middleton's starting point is that God would never do that.
Right.
And that is not a thing that God would ever do, ask for the life of a firstborn son. And so he goes through a long history of interpretation. And I also learned a lot about the history of interpretation of the Abraham Isaac story from Middleton. But that's the starting point.
Yeah.
And I'm not compelled by that. One of the main reasons being is that there are many times throughout the biblical story where God demands back the life of a firstborn son and does it.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he takes the lives of Judah's two sons, firstborn sons, in Genesis 38. They are killed by Yahweh.
Aaron's sons?
Kills Aaron's first two-born sons.
Wow.
He takes the life of all of the firstborn in Egypt, including Israelites. But he provides a substitute through Passover. And so, in other words, I think one of the problems that the Abraham and Isaac story poses for readers is that it seems arbitrary, like all of a sudden God's just demanding the life of this son. But most readings that see that as a huge ethical problem, I think, are ignoring the narrative momentum up to that point, that Abraham has these sons by means of his own scheming and Sarah's scheming, and they have hurt and abused people on the way to get these sons.
Now, the difference, though, with Abraham is God doesn't ask Judah to kill his sons or Aaron to kill his sons.
No, totally. Yeah, that's right.
Or Pharaoh to kill his sons.
Correct. Yes.
He just enacts the justice.
That's right. Yeah.
And so there's something else that's very cringy about saying God asked me to kill someone.
Yeah. He asked him to offer his innocent son as a going up offering, which is one of the offerings in Leviticus 1 that atones for sins.
And isn't what Middleton's saying is like, that's what the pagan gods do. Mm-hmm. That's not what Yahweh does.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And the Abraham story begins with, and Yahweh tested Abraham. So it raises the question, why? Why would God need to test Abraham in this specific way? well, what do I know about Abraham and his relationship to the future survival of his family? Well, man,
he went rogue.
He went rogue, and they are willing to sexually abuse and
send off to death.
Send off to death an Egyptian immigrant and her son. And I think what we're seeing in Genesis 22 is God bringing judgment on Abraham's sin and Sarah's sin.
But then ultimately...
But what you see is that God is going and does provide a substitute. In other words, the story of Abraham and Isaac is exploring the paradox of God's judgment and his covenant mercy and commitment to keep partnering with these humans who keep failing.
Yeah.
And so he both takes away and gives the life of Isaac in the same story. Because, there just happens to be a ram there, and that's not a surprise. God put it there.
Yeah.
Because that was the whole point.
Right.
The point was bringing Abraham to a place of surrender where he has to enact the sacrifice of his future in the form of his son for his sins, only to find that the moment he surrenders the life of his son, he receives it back with God's forgiveness and mercy. And the fact that the ram is there means that this was the plan all along. But the first sentence told me that because it was a test. It was a test of Abraham's trust.
But the test wasn't to say, hey, God, I know your character and you wouldn't actually ask me this, so I'm not going to do it.
Correct.
You're saying the test was, I don't get it.
Yeah.
It feels counter to what I think is right and good and makes sense.
Yeah.
But I am going to do what you say.
And I think the moral logic of it is I was willing to.
And you think Abraham should have been in a place where he was like, I get why I deserve this?
I don't know if that's where we're at. I don't know if we're to imagine him being there. His silence maybe seems to indicate that.
Yeah.
But I think for the reader, it's saying what Abraham did to Hagar and Ishmael was wrong.
This is justice.
Yeah. This is judgment on what he and Sarah did to Hagar and Ishmael.
And then look at how God wants to deal with justice. He does it in a way that's very merciful.
Yeah. God actually, in demanding that sacrifice, already has in motion a plan.
Which is very similar to God saying, I demand the firstborn of all of Pharaoh and Israel. But look, here is a way through it.
That's right. This is why Jesus sees a deep narrative pattern connection between the story of Isaac, the beloved son, and Passover. And all the gospel authors see this. That's why they show us Jesus being called the Son whom I love at Jesus' baptism, exactly the phrase used of Isaac. And then that's on one end of the Gospels. And then on the other end is Jesus offering his life for the sins of Israel during Passover. So Jesus is portrayed as an Isaac Passover lamb who is both the son dying for the sins of his family, but both also the substitute who will step into the place for others. So Passover is another narrative patterning about the death of the sons, but God providing a substitute.
Okay, there's some good stuff to chew on, right? The tests. Okay, so I should probably get this out in the open right off the bat. Yes, God has taken life, even firstborn sons. Firstborn, as in Egypt, directly from God via a death messenger, yet he has never asked another human being, much less the father of an innocent person. Let's remember, Isaac is not a child at this time. And he's asked them to sacrifice in obedience to him. Abraham is one generation from a pagan father. There are pagan practices in his very own past, most of which we have no clue. A test of what makes me different from them is not such a stretch of a test, really. It's not. So we'll continue the talk, but so far on this point, Tim and I will have to agree to disagree. and we'll talk some more. Secondly, how comfortable are you with these tests from God? How comfortable are you with the prospects that all tests are allowed by God? And some of them are not from God directly, i.e., Job, right? As an example. How comfortable are you with discerning between a real test from God and just choices that all men still have to make? The rain and sun fall on the just and the unjust. And what do we choose to do with that? As in discerning between a test and a choice. Are there choices in tests? Most definitely. But not all choices are tests. Can we agree there? How comfortable are you with God testing by using, how well do you know me? In the Abraham and Isaac story, I have an upside down thought to toss out, right? Is this part of God's character and his promises if you follow his ways and act in his character that blessing as this example can be seen in it. In other words, not to give not the give to get thought, not that prosperity gospel stuff, but follow my ways, know me, and trust. So in the Isaac story, we see the post report. What happens after? That story is filled with items that would challenge that thought about God if Tim goes that way. Isaac's relationship with Abraham is non-existent. Isaac's relationship with his son is broken. His son's is broken at best. Notice Isaac's choices. And Sarah dies shortly afterwards. The sages believe that Sarah was so traumatized by the event that it broke her. Yes, that's the white space between the letters, yet the text leans that direction with the totality of the story. Abraham obeys God. Abraham obeys God, and it damages all those around him. It's a paradigm shift to see it differently, as in Middleton's study, his view, and then begs the question, how well does one understand God and his character? And are we supposed to reflect that character? Tim mentions this test is a punishment for his earlier behavior. I have a few issues with that thought line, maybe a little bit. One, does God use the innocent as a bargaining chip for a test? Two, are we supposed to, as in, are there any examples in scripture of go get your own switch for punishment? You go get your own belt. I'm going to beat you with it, right? Here is the son, the one I told you I would provide. Remember, he already got chastised with the Ishmael story, right? And that chastise you for punishing the innocent one, but I'll use them to teach you a lesson and then cause harm in a relationship in the process. Relationships that God himself holds very dear. Oh, and as Tim mentions, the ram was there all along. Maybe for the sake of bantering discussion? Maybe should Abraham have picked up his head and noticed that before? Something to chew on. How well do you know me? Along with intercession for the innocent. We can see Ishmael was not the means for God's plan, right? How that was supposed to unfold. Poor choices on Abraham and Sarah's part. His is their kenegdo. Totally agree. I will say, for the sake of this discussion also, in context, I disagree with Tim's assessment of the treatment of Hagar, and I'll tell you why. It was very much the common practice in that Mediterranean Semitic culture to ensure the legacy and longevity of a family to use maidservants to mother children for the barren. Jacob, 2 generations down, right, has 12 sons with 2 wives and 2 maidservants. Those 2 are the tribes that make up the children of Israel. 2, Ishmael is given promises and blessings to him and his lineage. Quite nice, actually. And Hagar, protection. 3, the Torah actually does address the poor behavior in these stories earlier, right? And he corrects that behavior for future generations and how they're supposed to do it. And believe it or not, it doesn't address stop the practice. It says, when you're in this, don't act like them, act this way. We cannot overlay our current cultural understanding, morality, and practices on past foreign cultures. You can't do that. The treatment by Sarah, horrible. Abraham, not interceding on behalf of an innocent. Hagar and Ishmael was, in Tim's phrase, a fail, and I'll agree. Yet they were taken care of by God. God wanted Abraham to trust God, as in, I can't see how this is going to happen, but I'll do my part. Okay? We do see, actually, a better play out, at least in the future, with John the Baptist and Zechariah and Elizabeth, right? At least after the chastisement by Gabriel, and Zechariah goes home and does his part, left God to his. In other words, he went back home, laid with his wife, and Sarah and Elizabeth has a baby. You wonder if after all that, Zechariah looked back and saw any parallels between himself and Abraham? Interesting. Okay, so with these stories, we have another element to chew on. The responses to the test. What is our actual response to tests? Is it a safe response to respond to God and say, I'm not ready yet? Can we really honestly self-assess ourselves? That's the argument that they make with the children of Israel not making the deals. We're not ready yet for that. Can we really interact with God on this? Can we be aware of our state of being, that we can interact with that perspective, be honest, that honest, even fearful discussion? We often talk about God's plan, right? And if we really honestly looked at the story in the direction it's being lived, not the hindsight that we throw oft at it, right? Could they have seen God's plan, right? Are you aware when you're in the story that you're experiencing it? When we look back over their stories, we see the patterns, but they're not cookie cutter patterns, as in the same exact pattern. We see character as in actors. We see changes. We see changes in gender. We see upside down. We see inversed. And I think one of those things that stretches, that I think Tim might grasp on, one of those things we get is that there are corrections to patterns, and there's different ways that patterns play out. They're not cookie cutter. The patterns themselves can be layered, and they overlap with different patterns to link different stories together. It's not a singular pattern. And I got to thank Rabbi David Foreman for his brilliant insight to stretch me on this particular subject. And I got with him, and it's stretching with all the Hebrew that goes with it. And boy, I tell you, that's silent mode for me while I try to grasp that. So whichever pattern we get, the initial pattern that sets the wheel in motion, many of them start in the garden, that we understand, might not necessarily have been a good pattern. We agree with this, right? How it plays out might teach us each time it goes around, there's something else to learn. It's not the same thing. And it's not, I'll bite that maybe times we can say often with patterns that there's that they might do it wrong again or something might be going on. I don't know, that's part of the point. But don't forget, we covered in our Boaz and Ruth episode that the redemptive role in that relational pattern, the Ezer Kenegdo role that's played out, is played out correctly or at least better in that view of the pattern, unlike with Adam and Eve or Abraham and Sarah. My dad, in the last Dusty Feet episode, used a phrase, and there was Jesus. I'd like to stretch that thought a bit and use it with, and there was God. Okay? So it is only in the aftermath, the post-choice, the post-decision, the post-action, that we look back and oft are unaware that there was God. And we look back and see it maybe, but when you're in it, you're not thinking about that. You're not seeing it in the moment. The children of Israel, as we're reading, are in the moment in every single story. As the years go by, they might be able to start to look back and see those there was God moments. But in Torah, these first 5 books, there's almost none of that. Meaning they're actually interacting with God on part of it, or where there's an interaction. See, because we see direct interaction with God in a lot of these stories, but some of them we don't. When we get to certain decisions that are being made, especially with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob in this, we see those look back deals. The children of Israel are actually interacting with God, and those stories that are part of their pasts, are they seeing those connections yet? As Tim likes to call them, we call them the hyperlinks, right? Are they seeing the hyperlink connections? I'm not sure. That's our part of being so post the event. Fortunate? We get, because we're so much further down the point. We're so much later in these scrolls, right? We get it. My mom has helped me begin to become aware and maybe start to understand coincidences, that things we see in our lives, to look for the ripple of there was God. There was Jesus. When I'm in a discussion with someone or pondering something or something related pops up, seeing that, being aware of it, might be one of those moments. Being somewhere, crossing paths with somebody, anybody. Joey Christmas likes to call them divine appointments. And there was God. My mom's tried to help me, stretch me, and maybe, just maybe, see God in that moment, maybe while in the moment. Maybe. So in these patterns, we see lots of things. We see the repetitions of locations as well, right? In this area, in this mountain, is used many times, and sometimes under different names. Does that bother you? Does it confuse you? Certainly the latter, for sure, since most of us don't know much about the culture of the area. and the surrounding cultures, unless Far Eastern history is your thing. So why they might have had a different name, and the further we get from them and the culture, the more we tend not to know. Places had what the general local populace called it, right? What the outsiders or travelers might name it. And if someone had an experience there, they might also have given it a different name. All of that is perfectly normal. We just sometimes don't understand another's normal. We don't. When I lived in South Carolina, for a short time, I lived on the Naval Weapons Station in Goose Creek. Yet, I've heard many times it being called Duck Ditch by the locals. So John uses the phrase second guess God. And for some reason, it didn't sit well with me. That the phrase, again, it's a nuanced piece, and I'm comfortable with that. But I tend to have a different perspective thought. If I was told something about you, or that someone told me that you were telling me something, either about something or someone, or to do something, is it second guessing really to ask myself, is that really from them? Is that really something they would have said or told me to do? Does the information that I'm getting match the character of them? Would they act out of character? If one of the things, if anything, that I've had the fortune of learning as I study these scrolls and letters, it would be the consistent character of God. Let me make myself clear. He does not always do something the same way, but always within the character of God. If it wasn't that, why am I following? There's probably a very fine line at times between confusing and unknowing. Maybe it's one of the facets of discernment when we might be aware of the difference between I can't see how God will do this versus yes, I don't understand this, but this is not really reflecting the character of God. And maybe that's why many others don't follow God, because they can't see it. Or we have so misrepresented his character that we are the ones that sow the seed of confusion. We see in the main players' character traits, these main people, that God sees certain character attributes in them and he uses them. And those character traits are tested for consistency in them staying in character. Okay? So when you are in the moment, can you remember the stories we are reading or hearing about? About these guys, them in the moment stories. And so do they even really know that their character, and what character part they're being tested by, and that it's God that's testing them? Do they see the test in the moment? I remember in my Air Force days, as my duties on board aircraft would mandate, I was required to attend SEER training. That training was to prepare us for surviving. escape and evasion, and dealing with capture by the enemy. Okay. The military, in their training, has an agenda, things they need to test and see what your response is. Sometimes that's not so obvious. It's complicated training with multiple objectives, tests of character, in compromising situations, and certainly under duress. You very seldom, if ever, see the lessons coming, much less their objectives. You're just aware that they're there. It's not until after everything is complete that you find out whether you passed or not. I know for me that I saw parts of me and my character testing that I wouldn't wish that test on anyone. I wouldn't wish that duress, that compromise choice. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, ever. I wouldn't wish that training on my worst enemy. But it does give you a look into your character. So now, picture living your normal life every day. Sometimes maybe we're aware of a future expectation, maybe, but not really realizing that the tests are coming, much less what the objectives are, right? Job, no idea anything was coming, nor the enormity, just that his character was tested. And, might I add, with no resolution in sight. And he intercedes on behalf. God tells them, go bring your sacrifices to him, that he can intercede for you. He does it. Job, this isn't like, if you do this, ta-da, you win the prize. He has no idea of the resolution. He still chooses to intercede without even knowing. So when John brings up second guessing God, is it really that? Or is it, I'm not sure what's happening or how to react? But like I mentioned before, how well do I know the originator and possibly the messenger? How well do I know God or those that he's telling me to? John Collins. I love his inquiring mind and his willingness to engage. So I mention this with sensitivity, okay? He makes a point when he says, well, I'm just glad that in the end of the previous episode, not this one, but the end of the previous episode, he makes a point that he's glad that Jesus is our high priest and we can enter the throne room. Okay? Maybe I'm even picky with the context of the words, but those two, priest and throne room, are very separate terms. Jesus, Yeshua, as high priest, has nothing to do with access to the throne room. As king, he is for sure. But that's my point. When I say we blur the lines, when we cross boundaries, when we confuse things, if we are priests, then we answer to Yeshua as high priest. And we ask, how can we be priests and serve the nations, other people? That does not mean living isolated by ourselves. It's more as in, what would you have us do to serve? It's a very uncomfortable question. I mean, a really awkward question. Is what you, me, we, us acting as a priest? Or are we doing some different role? Do we want to do something or assume a role that's not part of that? And how might that priestly role be defined? We still continue to blur lines that, for the most part, in the stories themselves, are not blurred at all. High priest, holy of holies, priests, tabernacle, temple, and we have king, we have kingdoms, we have a throne room, we also have a kingdom of priests. For the sake of biblical patterning discussion, let's start at the beginning. Part of this is patterned by observation in the scripture, and some of it is that white space between the black lines. Okay. Adam and Chava, Eve, right? We oft call them priestly figures in the garden. I tend to agree there. Eden is a much larger land that the garden sat in, right? The garden in many cultures have these gardens, these luxurious places that the ruler would set up and put that in the garden. Kings would have that, but is in the garden. That was the special area that was isolated for only special people. So you have Eden, the land outside of Eden, and then you have the Garden of Eden. This is a special, set apart place in this land, right? A place for God to interact with his priests. We can debate Adam as the high priest. We'll do that some other time. But I use they with Adam and Eve, but he was supposed to commune and interact with God. Adam had tasks, i.e., naming the animals and passing on instructions to another. In this story's example, right, we have Tahava. Let's pass it on. This next one. And things to do and not do in the sacred space. The space only they have access to. We know the ending to that story. That's a priestly story, but we have also another biblical pattern to notice as well. The intercessor possibility, the one to step in and challenge God on their behalf, oft unbidden, and not all, actually all too often, they're not even asking for intercession, but the intercessor chose to step in. So Adam had the chance to, he messes up, he could have stepped up and said, I gave the woman a bad, I did not pass on the information accurately. Could have stepped up, said this, intercedes on her behalf. The opportunity is there. So one could go and say, there's an intercessor possibly. Something to think about. Noah, he obeyed God, acting in, and with God is acting in his character. No intercession, though. The fear of repetition after the flood, hence the rainbow covenant, and the story's pattern is muddled for sure. There's a whole bunch going on. That's a hot mess with Noah after that. A whole hot mess. So God's plan with bringing creation in from creation, decreation, recreation. So his plan plays out. How Noah responds and what happens with him and his children. Like I said, it's a hot mess for sure. Abraham obeyed God, was an intercessor, tested as an intercessor. Lot in Sodom. I think the missed opportunity for intercession with Ishmael and Hagar, that he could have stepped up and said, this isn't right. God said they do, but how we're treating them by sending her away, not by having him, but by sending them away. 3, Isaac on the mountain. Did he know the character of God that we have seen up to this point? And being asked the question, what is the difference between God, Yahweh, and them, the other gods that we're talking about, right? We see this constantly. Joseph obeyed God, kept focused on God, intercessor, not only for his family, but for the kingdom of Egypt and the surrounding community. Obeyed God to keep them safe. We need to remember that it's God who withheld the rain that sets the whole thing up in the first place. God still acted within his character as God. Joseph, suffering servant. King, pretty darn close as number 2, especially his actions, but good for discussion. Moses, intercessor, mediator, leader in a time before the kingdom of Israel. There's no king yet, but he led God's people, tested as an intercessor, especially and heavily. Aaron, high priest, appointed by God. No special qualifications that we're aware of or noted. Carmen made this point rather clear. Just who he was. Brother of Moses. Obviously, God sends him there to be Moses' spokesman. He gets this point. So he's appointed high priest. But with that, this is one where he and his sons and the lineage would be that role. Only because they were related to him. No special qualifications. They are tested as high priest, and he was. His sons very much as well. Was his action a little past the blame guy, especially when we had it's interesting because he kind of passed the blame at the golden calf. And don't forget, he was not selected to be that person until after the golden calf. Let's make that clear. He has no idea in the role. Even in that decision, with that action, God chooses him and his lineage. So he passed the blame there. But after that, when they mentioned that when his sons die, and the testing in that, inside the tabernacle, Aaron's silent. Maybe he understands more. We hear less. Interesting, especially for high priest. He is the only one with direct access to the Holy of Holies. Levites, chosen as a tribe, as in the group, by stepping up with Moses. I guess the test of not following the masses with the golden calf. And this is attributed to the whole clan. They were made the priestly tribe to perform the non-high priestly duties. The non-high priestly duties. First king, Saul, tested as king. David, second king, chosen by God as king. Expectation was, as the custom of the culture and the surrounding area as well, that sons would follow. This is one of the challenges. Solomon was the 10th son of David, tested as king. The interesting part, he puts him in the lineage of Messiah. You get the picture. Many folks tested for different roles. Specialty roles. So let's recap the roles. High priest, priests, king. In the kingdom of priests, we have a smaller group and then a much larger group, right? Locations involved with those groupings, we have the tabernacle, We have the Holy of Holies, Tabernacle Temple. We have the kingdom. We have a throne room. They are separate. So let's remember from the stories where and who the people are, where the masses are as well. I see a kingdom of priests, the children of Israel, and those who follow their God, serving the even greater masses, the rest of the nations, the world. Not everyone is supposed to, and notice I didn't say save, I said serve. Breathe on that one. Breathe deep. Not everyone is supposed to be a priest. Who would the priest serve? Then you just be the masses. Priests serve people. They represented Yahweh and also taught others about this God, about Yahweh. Carmen mentions that priests have no power outside themselves. It's a service and not a power rule role. We get judges for those in another specialty role. There's judges too, and we get there because that doesn't fall on the priest. Yet all of us can, at the permission of the king, enter the throne room. Priest and non-priest. Access is granted to all who ask. We do have a very different king as well. Unlike any other in history, as we saw in the example with his first visit, he often came to the masses, to the people. He sat with them. He ate with them. He taught them. He can come to your door and knock. And if you let him in, he will dine with you and you will dine with him. We have never seen that kingly type of behavior in history. He is truly a set apart, holy, kadosh, unique king. Yes, there are very much other specialty roles. Priests, right? Teachers, leaders. In the New Testament, we have bishops, deacons, elders, right? Who serve. Those, and we have those people also who are given words from God for us to hear and heed. The masses, we are not or ever have been, as the masses, the specialty roles. God defines who they are or were, and they're chosen by Him. Maybe another facet of discernment is being aware of the character of God, and then when men speak, being able to hear the voice and words of God, as in that would be His character, or are we just hearing folks who like to talk? We know that was a concern for Moses because he asked the question, why should they listen to me? One should probably review the roles or duties of the priests, the Levites, and others to see the roles of these folks in the kingdom. And what do they do? If there's a role that's defined, priests, deacons, bishops, elders, whatever, take the roles that we have, right? And go find out what they do. And then when somebody says they are, one, are they? Two, what are they saying? Three, what are they doing? Four, are they reflecting the character of our God? I think maybe the string that binds them all together, a red string, is maybe the three-stranded cord, right? So we'll go with scripture. The service to God, the service to man, as in the people, and the commitment to represent the character of the Creator and our King. That's for another discussion. But suffice to say, we are not all the specialty roles. There are a lot of us who, just like farmers, just like to feed folks. Just like to feed folks. Okay, so we'll have part 2 next week. We'll get into the questions, which will be more fun because there's obviously, he said in the beginning, there's 9, 10 questions, whatever. There'll be more questions to ask. This was a big chunk piece in this. So let's ponder this and then we'll get to the questions because the questions themselves also are really good ones. And one of them comes from somebody very young. It's really cool. So, on a point to ponder for the evening, again, kind of have fun, go back to Toby Mac, and having a discussion with another friend of mine. This is very apropos for the part of the discussions that we've been talking about. Come across, it says, I just saw a post I didn't agree with. I kept scrolling. Try it sometime. It didn't hurt at all. Thanks, Toby Mac. #SpeakLife. Thanks for with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.